What if I told you that Brazil created something so powerful that the United States opened a trade investigation to try to destroy it? I'm not talking about oil, weapons, or military technology. I'm talking about a payment method, a simple system that lets you transfer money in seconds. Sounds like an exaggeration? Then explain to me why, in 2025, the world's biggest economic power is investigating Pix for unfair competition. What you're about to discover in the next few minutes will completely change how you see money, power, and digital sovereignty. Brasilia, November of 2020. While the world was battling the pandemic, Brazil's central bank quietly launched the most revolutionary instant payment system on the planet. No one imagined what was coming. The federal capital was about to host a revolution that would change how 200 million people relate to money. The first clue that something extraordinary was happening came from the numbers. In just 3 months, the first quarter of 2021, 79% of Brazilian transactions were already instant. Person to person. No fees, no intermediaries, no cards. Money simply flowed from account to account in seconds, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It was as if Brazil had discovered financial teleportation. But here's the first secret no one told you. Pix cost only $4 million to develop. $4 million. American tech companies spend that on launch parties. Brazil's central bank, in Brasilia, built internally the most advanced payment infrastructure in the world for the price of a luxury house in Miami. It was cheap because it was national. It was fast because it was mandatory. In 2021, as the system completed its first year, something surprising began to happen on the streets of São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, Salvador. Street vendors started displaying QR code signs. Street artists on Avenida Paulista accepted Pix. Craftsmen in Pelourinho, in Salvador, had their payment keys written by hand. Acarajé vendors in Copacabana were getting instant payments through their phones. Brazil's informal economy, historically invisible to banks, was being digitized overnight, and no one was forcing it. It was happening organically because it made sense. A vendor who once carried change and risked being robbed now simply showed a QR code. No card machine charging 2.2%. No bank visits. The money hit the account in 3 seconds. The 2022 numbers revealed the scale of the phenomenon: 24 billion transactions. The use of cash plummeted from 42% in 2020 to 22% in 2023. Pix had killed physical money faster than any government policy ever could. And it did so voluntarily because it was simply better. But then came the question no one was asking. If Pix was so good, why did the banks accept it? Why did financial giants that made billions from fees just let that money go? Why didn't credit card companies fight back? The answer will surprise you. They were forced to. The Central Bank of Brazil did something no developed nation dared to do. It made participation mandatory for any institution with more than 500,000 clients. Brazil's major banks were forced to join a system that would cannibalize their own revenue streams. And here's the irony. The same banks that complained now depend on Pix to stay relevant. But while this was happening in Brazil, on the other side of the world, in Washington, D.C., and New York, tech executives and analysts began to notice something dangerous was happening in a South American country. Something that needed to be contained. Because Pix wasn't just a successful app. It was a model. It was proof that an alternative to American financial dominance existed. Washington, D.C., July of 2023. While Brazil celebrated 42 billion Pix transactions, the United States finally launched its instant payment system, FedNow, 3 years after Brazil. Guess how many institutions joined at launch? 35. Only 35 banks in a country with more than 4,500 financial institutions. Why? Because in the United States, participation was voluntary. And American banks had a clear reason to resist. They make fortunes off transfer fees. The slower the system, the more money stays locked up, generating interest. Instant payments destroy that model. When you make a traditional transfer in the U.S., the money can take 3 days to move. During those days, it's in banking limbo. And banks use that money for operations that earn interest. Billions in profits that vanish with instant payments. So American banks resisted. And the Federal Reserve, unlike Brazil's central bank, didn't have the courage to force them. Because in the United States, banks don't obey the government. Banks finance the government. But the story gets even more interesting when we go back to Brazil in 2024. On April 6th, Pix processed 250.5 million transactions in a single day, moving 124.4 billion reais. That was more money in 24 hours than many countries move in months. And the system didn't crash, it didn't freeze, running on infrastructure that cost $4 million. But there's more. Pix had transcended its original function. It had become culture. The phrase "Fazem Pix" entered Brazilian vocabulary like Google it. It became a country song lyric. It became a meme. It became national identity. And here lies the crucial detail. When 165 million people use the same system every day, it stops being technology. It becomes critical infrastructure. In Sao Paulo, a manicurist gets paid through Pix. In Manaus, a fisherman sells fish using a QR code. In Porto Alegre, during floods, families sent money instantly to relatives in need. Pix had become the financial nervous system of Brazil. And unlike the American model, it was controlled by the Brazilian state by a public institution. And that's when Silicon Valley started to worry. Because 60% of Brazil's low-income population doesn't have a credit card but does have Pix. That means 160 million Brazilians making digital transactions without going through Visa, MasterCard, Apple Pay, or Google Wallet. It means consumer data, behavioral patterns flowing through a system that American companies don't control. And data is worth more than oil. Because with data, you can predict behavior, offer credit, control narratives. Whoever controls data controls the future. And Brazil had created a system where 160 million people generated data under Brazilian control. That wasn't inconvenient. It was a strategic threat. The Office of the United States Trade Representative officially opens an investigation against Pix. The accusation? Unfair competition. According to them, because it's public and free, Pix prevents Apple Pay and Google Wallet from entering the Brazilian market. Let's pause for a second. Apple is worth $3.5 trillion. Google, controlled by Alphabet, is worth $2 trillion. Together, these companies have a higher market value than the combined GDP of all African nations. And they're complaining about unfair competition from an emerging country that spent 4 million reais to create a public system. Let me rephrase that. The United States is investigating Brazil because the Brazilian government created a system that's too efficient. Because it dared to offer free transfers to the population. Because it built something better than American big tech. It's like investigating the Netherlands for having bike lanes that are too good. It's like suing Sweden for having internet that's too fast. It's like punishing Finland for having free, high-quality education. Absurd. And notice the irony. In the US, a transfer via Venmo, owned by PayPal, costs between 0.5 and 3% of the total. A bank transfer via Zelle is free, but banks charge monthly account maintenance fees that go up to $25. In Brazil, Pix is free for individuals, no maintenance fees, no hidden charges, no fine print. So who's really practicing unfair competition here? But the investigation isn't about trade fairness. Analysts are clear. It's about data. It's about control. It's about preventing Brazil from developing digital sovereignty. Because a country that controls its payment infrastructure can make independent decisions. It can track financial flows. It can implement autonomous monetary policies. It can resist external economic sanctions. And independent nations are dangerous to empires. Think about what happened with Iran. In 2012, the United States cut the country off from SWIFT, the international financial messaging system headquartered in Brussels but under American influence. Overnight, Iran was isolated from the global banking system. Iranian banks could no longer make international transfers. Foreign trade collapsed. Now imagine if Iran had, back in 2012, a system like Pix integrated with China, Russia, and India. Would sanctions have had the same effect? No. And that's why Washington is nervous. And here's where China enters the game. Because while the U.S. investigates Pix, Brazil is moving closer to the BRICS, the bloc, led by China and Russia. And Pix proves it's possible to create alternatives to Western infrastructures. If Brazil pulled it off for 4 million, what's stopping China, India, Russia, or South Africa from doing the same? What's stopping the integration of these systems into a BRICS network that completely bypasses SWIFT? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. And that's terrifying Washington. China already has its own system, CIPS, the Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, launched in 2015. It processes transactions in yuan and connects Chinese banks to the world without using SWIFT. By 2024, CIPS had 1,500 participants in 110 countries. It's smaller than SWIFT, which has 11,000 institutions, but it's growing 30% a year. Russia created SPFS, the System for Transfer of Financial Messages, after the 2014 sanctions. By 2024, it had 556 participants, including banks from Belarus, Armenia, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan. India has UPI, the Unified Payments Interface, which processes 14 billion transactions a month, more than PIX. Now imagine these systems integrated. A Brazilian sending reais through PIX to an Indian who receives rupees through UPI, all without dollars in between, without SWIFT, without American banks charging fees. That's already being tested. In August of 2024, Brazil and India announced a pilot project to connect PIX and UPI. And what if this scales to all BRICS countries? The original five, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, represent 42% of the world's population and 26% of global GDP. In 2024, the bloc expanded. Saudi Arabia, Iran, the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, and Ethiopia joined. Now it's 10 countries, 47% of the population, 36% of GDP. If these countries connect their payment systems, the dollar loses relevance. American sanctions lose effectiveness. Western financial control over the world begins to dissolve. Because American dominance doesn't come from technological superiority. It comes from getting there first, from creating dependency, from setting standards everyone follows because there's no viable alternative. And now that dependency is being challenged by a Brazilian app that anyone with a high school education can use. International expansion and the domino effect. Buenos Aires, Montevideo, Santiago. Companies are already offering international PIX. The Argentine fintech CamiPay lets Brazilians pay in reais in Argentina, and Argentines receive pesos instantly. PagBrazil offers an integrated solution in Uruguay and plans expansion to Chile, Mexico, and Portugal. Even Fiserv, an American financial services giant with $1.4 billion in annual revenue, is testing ways to take the PIX model to Argentina, the United States, and Canada. When even American companies start copying the Brazilian model, something fundamental has shifted in the order of things. In 2023, Brazil's central bank president, Roberto Campos Neto, said he was working with the Bank of Italy and the BIS, the Bank for International Settlements, the central bank of central banks, to define international instant payment rules. Read that again. Brazil as a technical reference for Europe. Brazil teaching standards to Italy. Brazil setting rules that the BIS, based in Switzerland, will spread worldwide.